More than half of Iran's population is now malnourished. That's not according to a sanctions report or a foreign intelligence agency. That's according to Iran's own Ministry of Social Welfare. Iran is the fourth largest oil producer on the planet. There's a version of this story that everyone has been telling. A small, sanctioned country, armed with drones that cost $20,000 each, forcing the most powerful military alliance in the world to spend $500,000 every single time it wants to shoot one down. That's a compelling story. It's the kind of asymmetric math that makes geopolitical analysts excited. The kind of headline that writes itself. But there is a version of this story that almost no one is telling. And it starts with a simple question. What happens when the country that's winning the economic exchange can't actually afford to win? Iran is a petrostate sitting on the second largest natural gas reserves in the world. It has also been suffering rolling blackouts in its own capital city. For years, what we're going to do in this video is something that almost no one covering this conflict has done. We're going to forget, just for a moment, about missiles and military doctrine. We're going to look at the ledger. We're going to look at what Iran could actually afford before this war started, what it can afford now, and what that tells us about how and when this ends. Because here is the thing about fighters who are already malnourished before the bell rings. They can still land devastating blows, but they are still on a timer. To understand where Iran is right now, you have to understand where Iran was. And where Iran was, even before a single bomb dropped, is genuinely strange. This is a country that, on paper, should be one of the wealthiest in its region. It has the fourth largest proven oil reserves on the planet. It has the second largest natural gas reserves. It has a population of 88 million people, educated, young, historically entrepreneurial. And yet, as of early this year, more than a third of Iranians were living on less than $9 a day, after adjustments for purchasing power parity. $9 in a country that is literally floating on top of the most valuable commodity in the world. So how does that happen? The answer is layers, and every layer you peel back reveals something more dysfunctional than the last. The first layer is the most obvious. For roughly 40 years, Iran has been one of, if not the most, heavily sanctioned countries on Earth, trading that dubious distinction back and forth only with Russia and North Korea. There's a whole political debate to be had about why those sanctions exist and whether they're fair. But for our purposes, the economic impact is what matters. Sanctions mean Iran can't freely sell its oil on international markets, which means a country that should be swimming in petrodollar revenue isn't. It also means Iran struggles to import the industrial components needed to maintain its own oil rigs. So the machinery that extracts the oil starts to break down, which means they produce less oil, which means less revenue to fix the machines. Read that loop again slowly. An oil-rich country, unable to maintain its oil infrastructure because it can't sell enough oil to afford the parts to extract the oil. That's the kind of structural trap that takes decades to build and almost as long to escape. The one partial exception to all of this is China. China doesn't officially sanction Iran. It actively buys Iranian crude, at a significant discount, of course, to feed its famously energy-hungry economy. In return, it supplies Iran with manufactured goods. On paper, this sounds like a lifeline. But here's the catch. Chinese companies, even if the Chinese government doesn't sanction Iran, still can't openly do business with Tehran if they want to keep doing business with the United States. And for most companies, the choice between the American consumer market and some discounted oil from a country where a third of the population lives on $9 a day is not a difficult choice. So even China's support is constrained, partial, unofficial. It is a lifeline made of fraying rope. But sanctions alone don't explain everything. Because the third layer of this economic disaster is entirely self-inflicted. Iran's domestic economy is dominated by a set of institutions called bonyads. A bonyad is something like a private business, a religious organization, a state company, and a government department all fused together into one entity. They don't pay taxes. They're exempt from the regulations that normal businesses have to follow. They have access to funding no private competitor could ever match. The result? Every sector they enter, they crowd out real competition, real innovation, real efficiency. And whatever profit they generate flows back, not to ordinary Iranians, but to the political elite running them. This is not an accident. It is a system designed to extract. And then there's the most direct form of extraction. A 6-month Reuters investigation uncovered an organization called SATAD, controlled by Iran's supreme leadership. Total assets, roughly $95 billion, made up of approximately $52 billion in real estate and $43 billion in corporate holdings. Much of it built by seizing the properties of ordinary Iranians, religious minorities, immigrants, political opponents, accumulated over decades. Now, $95 billion in Australian real estate gets you a modest 2-bedroom apartment somewhere outside Sydney. In Iran, the scale of those seizures had to be vast to reach that number. And where did that money go? Not into schools, not into infrastructure, not into water systems or power grids. A significant share went into funding one of the most disproportionately large military apparatuses relative to its economy in the world. Official military spending sits at around 2% of GDP, but actual military spending, including the Revolutionary Guard and proxy funding across the region, reaches estimates as high as 10%. And beyond its own military, Iran has been bankrolling other people's militaries. Reports indicate the average Hezbollah soldier is paid more than 10 times what the average Lebanese army soldier earns. 10 times. While Iranian civilians go malnourished. This is what economists mean when they talk about resource misallocation. Not just poor decisions, not just bad luck. A system deliberately constructed to funnel a nation's wealth away from the people it belongs to, and into a military machine built to project power beyond its own borders. Here's the detail that will stay with you. Iran is sitting on the second largest natural gas reserves on the planet. And yet Tehran has had rolling blackouts for years. Not occasionally, regularly. In summer. In winter. Because the power grid is old, underinvested, and stitched together with whatever parts managed to slip through the sanctions net. And in winter, when domestic heating demand spikes, the government cuts exports to keep the lights on at home, which means less revenue to fix the grid, which means more blackouts. That was Iran before the war. Sanctioned, mismanaged, energy-rich and energy-short at the same time, with a population that had been losing patience for years. And then the bombs started falling. In late February of this year, after months of escalating tension and another round of nuclear inspections collapsing, the United States and Israel carried out targeted strikes on Iran's underground nuclear facilities. That was supposed to be the end of it. Depending on who you asked, this was either a 2-week operation or a 2-day affair. We are now in the 3rd month. Almost immediately, secondary sanctions were tightened, designed to make it nearly impossible for any non-Chinese buyer to keep purchasing Iranian crude. Infrastructure on both sides took damage, but the Iranian side absorbed the bulk of it. Refineries, power stations, government buildings, and the real. Iran's currency, which had been sliding for years, didn't just fall. It collapsed. When Iran's current central bank governor took office in late 2022, $1 bought you around 430,000 reals. As of late April this year, it's trading at 1.6 million reals to the dollar. That is the single least valuable currency on the planet by most measures. 3/4 of its value. Gone. In just over 3 years. A currency chart is abstract. Let me make it concrete. When your currency loses 3/4 of its value, the price of imported goods doesn't rise by 75%. It quadruples. Every imported component, every piece of industrial equipment, every foreign medicine, every food item that crosses a border, roughly 4 times more expensive in local terms, overnight. Annual inflation was already running at 44% before the conflict started. In the first weeks of active fighting, point-to-point inflation ran above 60%. That is not prices rising by the year. That is prices rising by the week. Economists have a phrase for what happens next. They call it inflation expectations becoming unanchored. It's a clinical way of saying nobody trusts the currency to hold its value long enough to bother saving in it. When that happens, people stop saving. They spend immediately. They move money into gold, dollars, property, anything that won't evaporate while they sleep. And that behavior accelerates the very inflation it's responding to. It becomes a self-reinforcing spiral. And the war poured fuel on it. The predictable result was mass protests, motivated by the same deteriorating living conditions that had been building for years, made suddenly intolerable by the visible reality that whatever hard currency the state still had, it was spending on missiles and proxies rather than bread, water, or fuel. These demonstrations have been suppressed, harshly, which, ironically, became one of the stated justifications for the next round of strikes, which caused more economic damage, which caused more protests. Every loop in Iran's crisis feeds the next one. And then something happened that almost nobody saw coming. Or rather, something that everybody should have seen coming, because it had been building for years, but whose timing made it undeniable. The United Arab Emirates announced it is leaving OPEC, effective May 1st. Officially, the story is clean. The UAE has been pushing for years to expand production toward 5 million barrels per day by 2027. OPEC quotas were in the way. The exit had been telegraphed, but the timing is not subtle. The announcement came after weeks of Iranian missile and drone strikes on UAE territory. After months of Gulf OPEC members watching their tanker traffic grind to a halt because one fellow OPEC member had effectively shut down the Strait of Hormuz. OPEC is one of the most consequential economic organizations in human history. It has managed global oil prices, imperfectly but durably, for half a century, and it is now openly fragmenting because of a war fought by one of its own founding members. For Iran specifically, this matters in a way that goes beyond the symbolism. OPEC was the last major international organization that Iran was actually part of in any meaningful sense. Even within OPEC, Iran had spent the last decade as the awkward, sanctioned cousin nobody wanted to coordinate with anyway. Now even that floor has been removed. The one remaining mechanism that gave Iran any leverage over global energy markets is cracking apart around it. Here is the version of this story that gets told most often. Iran is holding the global economy hostage with drones that cost $20,000 each. Every time one gets shot down, the interceptor costs $500,000. The math clearly favors Iran. And as long as Iran can cost the world more than the world can cost Iran, it holds the cards at the negotiating table. That logic is not wrong, but it is incomplete. And the part it's missing is the most important part. Iran has, in effect, turned the Strait of Hormuz into a toll booth. Most commercial traffic is blocked. The cost imposed on global shipping flows, at least in theory, back into its asymmetric military capacity. Cheap drones, cheap mines, cheap missiles. And they have stockpiles, large ones, built up over years of planning for exactly this kind of scenario. But here's the thing about stockpiles. By definition, they are finite. and most of the production capacity needed to replenish them sits inside the same heavily sanctioned, sporadically electrified industrial base that has been struggling for years. So the question isn't whether Iran can keep fighting. The question is what the fighting is actually costing, and who runs out first. And here is where the analysis gets genuinely uncomfortable, because the answer depends entirely on a distinction that almost no one is making. The economic systems that support the Iranian military and the economic systems that support the Iranian people do not have nearly as much overlap as they do in most other countries. In a normal economy, when military spending crowds out civilian spending, you feel it across the board. Inflation rises, public services deteriorate, voters push back. Democratic pressure creates a correction. Iran is not that kind of economy. The military, specifically the Revolutionary Guard, has its own supply chains, its own funding mechanisms, its own shadow financial infrastructure, partially routed through the bonyads, partially through foreign proxies, partially through channels that barely appear in any official accounting. What this means, in practical terms, is something quite chilling. The Iranian military can potentially keep firing drones for another year or two, while the civilian population runs out of food, not metaphorically. The population that was already 50% malnourished before this war started is going to run out of food before the military runs out of drones. Most war economy analyses assume that a country's ability to fight degrades roughly in proportion to the suffering of its civilian population. When people suffer enough, they either revolt or the state's revenue base collapses, both of which eventually force the military to stand down. But Iran's structure is specifically designed to decouple those two things. The regime can sustain the military machine even as civilian infrastructure crumbles beneath it, which means the question of how long this conflict goes on is not primarily a question of military capability. It's a question of social stability. Can the regime continue to suppress a population that is malnourished, broke, and watching its savings evaporate, while simultaneously maintaining the loyalty it needs to keep its own military apparatus functioning? History has answers to that question. They are not uniformly encouraging for governments in that position. Meanwhile, outside Iran's borders, the damage is spreading in every direction. Global oil prices have been volatile in ways that ripple into everything else. Energy security in Europe, already fragile, is facing a new stress test. Food production chains that depend on energy-intensive shipping are being squeezed. And then there's Dubai. Dubai spent the last decade building itself into the world's most compelling argument that the Middle East could be a global hub for finance, tourism, and international business. The entire pitch rested on one premise: stability. Iranian missile and drone strikes on UAE territory don't just create physical damage. They create something far more durable and damaging: uncertainty. And uncertainty is the single most corrosive force in the business of attracting international capital. Every major corporation that was building a regional headquarters in Dubai is now running a new risk model. Every sovereign wealth fund routing investments through the Gulf is now asking questions that wouldn't have been asked 18 months ago. The Saudi diversification strategy. Vision 2030, the pivot away from oil dependency, runs directly through the assumption that the region is stable enough to attract the kind of long-term investment those ambitions require. That assumption is now under stress. And then there is the largest variable of all, the one that connects everything else. The petrodollar system, the arrangement by which oil is priced and traded in US dollars, giving the dollar its status as the world's reserve currency, is already under long-term pressure from multiple directions. China and Russia have been pushing for years to establish alternative settlement mechanisms. But the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, have historically been the anchor of that system. Their willingness to hold dollars and price their oil in dollars has been one of the foundational stability mechanisms of the entire post-1970s global financial order. Now, those same Gulf states are watching one of their own region's major players destabilize the very shipping lanes that make their oil valuable. And they are, quietly, carefully, but noticeably, beginning to ask questions about the future of those arrangements. No one is announcing the end of the petrodollar, but the cracks are visible. And cracks in systems as complex as global financial architecture tend to widen before anyone is ready to admit they're there. So what does all of this actually mean? Let's run through the realistic scenarios, not as a military analyst, but purely from a ledger perspective. Scenario 1 is the one Iranian military doctrine is built around. The asymmetric cost exchange keeps working. The world calculates that the pain of the blocked strait outweighs the cost of a negotiated settlement. Iran walks away with something: a ceasefire, sanctions relief, a new nuclear agreement. Is this possible? Yes. The drone-to-interceptor math still holds. The cost imposition on global shipping is real. The political appetite in Europe and Asia for a prolonged conflict affecting their energy supply is genuinely limited. But in this scenario, the regime survives. The people of Iran? The math is far bleaker for them regardless of outcome. Scenario 2 is what historians of economic warfare tend to consider the more likely long-term path. The civilian economy reaches a breaking point. The combination of hyperinflation, food insecurity, destroyed infrastructure, and visible government indifference triggers something the regime cannot suppress, even with its demonstrated willingness to use extreme force. This isn't speculation, it's pattern recognition. The Shah fell in 1979 not because he lost a military confrontation. He lost the social contract. The Islamic Republic survived 2009 and 2019 and the 2022 protests. But each of those waves came from a population that was suffering, not starving. A population that is malnourished, watching its savings evaporate weekly and living with the knowledge that what little remains of the national wealth is being spent on foreign proxy armies. That is a different kind of social pressure. Scenario 3 is the wild card. The fragmentation of OPEC removes Iran's last meaningful lever over global energy prices, as more Gulf states either leave the cartel or independently expand production, at least partially to compensate for the disruption Iran is causing. The global oil price could fall. For Iran, that's existential. The entire economic logic of using the strait as leverage depends on oil being expensive enough that threatening to disrupt it matters. If non-Iranian producers fill the gap effectively, the leverage evaporates. And with it, the only financial rationale for continuing the conflict from Iran's side. This is the scenario nobody is talking about, and it may be the one with the most decisive economic consequences. Here is the honest summary. Iran can probably keep its military operational for some time yet. The stockpiles are large. The doctrine is effective. The asymmetric cost exchange is real. But look at what surrounds that military. The currency is the weakest on Earth. Inflation is running at rates that wipe out an entire year's savings in 12 months. The power grid is unreliable. The water table is dropping. Half the population, by their own government's count, is malnourished. And the regional cartel that gave the country its only real form of global economic relevance is actively breaking apart. A regime in that position can keep launching drones for a while. The harder problem, the one that no amount of military doctrine can solve, is that it also has to keep feeding and watering and powering the population doing the launching. And the room to do both of those things at once is shrinking by the month. That is the real timer in this conflict, and it is not running on the side of the Islamic Republic. History has a word for empires that spent themselves into military power while their domestic base crumbled beneath them. It does not use the word victory. The question, The one that nobody has a clean answer to is whether the regime in Tehran knows that, and whether it matters to the people making those decisions, if it does. When a government can sustain its military longer than it can sustain its own people, who is that military ultimately fighting for? What we are watching in real time is what the end of a petro regime looks like in slow motion. Not necessarily the end of Iran, but possibly the end of the particular system that has run it for 40 years. And the countries, the corporations, and the investors who understand that transition and position themselves accordingly will be looking at a very different map when the smoke clears. The question is whether they're paying attention to the ledger or just the explosions. Important thing I want to share you where nobody noticed. Right now, somewhere in America, a 67-year-old woman named Margaret is sitting at her kitchen table, staring at her retirement statement, her annuity, her safe money, the account she spent 40 years building. And she has absolutely no idea that buried underneath layers of financial engineering, shell companies, Bermuda trusts, and trillion-dollar chip deals, her retirement savings are quietly funding Elon Musk's artificial intelligence empire. The man who predicted the 2008 crash is calling the whole thing fugazi. So here's the question nobody is asking. If the world's most valuable AI company is moving billions of dollars of risk off its balance sheet and into the retirement accounts of ordinary Americans, what happens to those accounts when the music stops? That's the next video. It's on your screen right now. And if this kind of deep dive economic analysis is what you come here for, subscribe. There's more coming.